In this video, we'll show you how to create a two-tone effect with solder inlay. First, you're going to need a recessed area in your metal, and using a pattern plate is a perfect way to do that. So I'm going ahead and setting the rolling mill for the proper tension for this plate with my annealed copper. I'm using 18 gauge copper, and I'm noting where the rolling mill is tight, then loosening it up to get my material out, and then tightening it back down to where it was, and then again about another quarter turn. This is going to depend on your rolling mill, but for us and this mill, a quarter turn tight works great. So I'm going to roll it through, and you want to make sure that you feel, you have to use muscle, but you don't want to be throwing all of your body weight into rolling these things. So we'll check it out and see how I did, and it looks like I got a great impression. I need a recessed area that's going to be deep enough that I can flood it with solder and then file or sand all the excess off and be left with a design. So our next step is to just take this and flood those recessed areas with solder. So I'm going to go ahead and flux this piece, and this flux is real old, so it's nice and chunky, but it still works. And the flux is going to keep the metal clean. So you don't want to skimp on flux here. It gets kind of sticky and gooey when it gets hot, but what it's doing is it's absorbing the oxides that come when you're heating the metal, which is going to keep the metal clean, which is necessary for the solder to flow. So flux is our friend here. We really want to make sure we have enough flux because we're going to get this piece of metal really, really, really hot in order to flow the solder in all the areas, and we don't want to exhaust the flux before we're done flowing that solder. So I'm just giving the piece a really good coat, going a little overboard on the flux, but it'll help me in the end. All right, and then we're gonna heat this piece, and there's two different ways you can kind of go about this. You can place little tiny solder chips like you normally would and kind of lay them out in all those recessed areas, or you can do what's called stick feeding. Stick feeding is hard to control, and it's a little bit messy, but for this process, we're getting pretty messy anyway, because what we're doing is we're putting enough solder on the surface of the metal that it's gonna fully fill those recessed areas and actually overflow them. So we're gonna use a lot of solder, and stick feeding saves a lot of time, both cutting up little chips and then placing all those chips. So it can be a good time to practice your stick feeding. And stick feeding is simply just holding the wire solder up against the surface of the metal as the metal reaches the temperature that the solder flows at, and it will just flow right on the surface. You'll see it happen. So here I'm still heating the metal. I've kind of smoothed out the flux, and as the metal gets hot, I'm gonna stick my solder on there. And if it's not hot enough, you'll see the solder kind of start to like chunk off and leave like blobs on the surface. That's okay for this process, but what we're looking for is the temperature where the solder just immediately turns to liquid as it touches the surface. So we need to get this a little bit hotter. We're going to use the torch, heat very evenly, and then continue just kind of testing, brushing that solder on the surface until we start to see it go liquid. And then as it goes liquid, we're just going to use it to fill in all those recessed areas as quickly as possible. And it's just melting right onto the surface. This is a good way to practice heat control. And like I said, it's pretty sloppy, it's hard to control, but for this process, that's really okay. So you can see I'm just using a lot of solder to get down into all those recessed areas of the design. And then you want to fully flow that solder so it's nice and smooth. And I don't want to have to come back in here and fill in areas that I missed. So I'm making sure that I'm paying close attention and making sure that I'm really overfilling every recessed area so that I don't have to do this 2 times. All right, then we'll pickle it and take a look and see how we did and see if we do indeed need to come back and backfill some areas that we missed. It looks like I got a lot of solder on there. And it looks like I didn't quite fully flow it. You can still kind of see the outline of the solder. So what I'm gonna do here, this is after pickling. I'm gonna cut off this excess metal that I haven't worked on yet, reduce the size of my piece so that it doesn't require as much heat to be brought up to soldering temperature. And then I'll go back to the soldering board, reflux this piece, heat it up again, and just reflow that solder until it smooths out. So again, we're gonna flux it. And then once I've got the entire surface coated in flux, I'm just gonna hit it with the torch and bring it back up to temperature to flow all of that solder fully so that it's nice and smoothed out and even on the surface. And then I did notice one small area where I was missing some solder, so I'm gonna go ahead and add a small little piece of solder to that area while I do this, and then I should be good to start the removal process. So here you can see I'm just bringing this up to temperature, heating it for the flux to kind of calm down a little bit. I like to use a solder picks to smooth the flux out on the surface, make sure I have like a really nice even coat across the surface so all the metal stays clean. And then have a little chunk of solder here that I'm just gonna place in the area where I need it a little bit more. And just heat until I can bring this piece up to the temperature that the solder flows at. And I'm using hard solder. I prefer to use hard. It's the closest color match to silver. It has the highest silver content of the silver solders. So it's gonna be a whiter metal. The more alloy you add in to bring that melting temp down, the more yellow in color the solder gets. But once we've flowed that solder, then we're ready to pickle and clean and come and start finishing. So here I've got, I like to use PSA sanding discs. You can use whatever sanding wheels are your preference. Traditionally, people would put a soft curve in this piece of metal and go at it with a file. That still takes a really long time, and I like to do things a little bit quicker. So I'm placing my metal on just a block of steel. This is actually just the back of an impression die. And then sanding with these PSA sanding discs. And the reason I like to put it on top of the impression die is because it draws the heat out of the metal that happens as I'm sanding it with the flex shaft, and I can work on the piece longer without it getting really hot in my hands. So it just acts as a heat sink, lets me hold on to the piece a bit longer. And I'm really carefully sanding here, keeping my eyes on the piece the whole time to make sure that as soon as I start to reveal my design, I'm gonna slow way down on the sanding because we have a recessed area that we made with that pattern plate, but that recessed area is not very deep. And if I'm not careful, I can sand right through it, and that would be a big bummer. There are other techniques you can use to get deeper recesses, like engraving or chasing or etching or even stamping. Those are all great choices for solder inlay. This one is a little more precarious just because the pattern plates aren't super deep, but it still works great. So you can see I'm starting to kind of reveal that little Gothic window design. I need to be really careful now with my sanding. So I'm going to keep working on the other areas with more solder, but I'm going to be aware of the areas that the design is revealed and just take off a lot less material as I move forward. All right, and I've skipped over some of the video of sanding here just so you don't have to watch me sand all day. This does save significant time with using the flex shaft versus doing it by hand, but it is still a time-consuming process. You can also see how much debris is coming off. We're removing a lot of metal, and you don't want to be breathing that or getting it in your eyes, so make sure you're wearing a dust mask and proper eye protection. So if we catch this in the right light, you can see how the designs have started to reveal themselves. I'm trying to sand as evenly as possible so I don't sand low spots in the surface. I want to keep the surface nice and flat. And I'm just working in kind of quadrants on this piece so that I'm working on not too tiny of an area, but not also a huge area where I can't really keep track of, where I've worked and where I haven't. Kind of doing one window at a time here. And this PSA sanding disc that I'm using is a more abrasive one. It's a 220 grit. But as soon as I get through the majority of the solder, I will jump down to a 320 or a 400 to refine the surface even more. So again, skipping through ahead a bit in the video here, but this is after a finer sanding with the PSA sanding disc. And you can see all that material that's come off here. It's a lot. And then the solder inlay shows up much better with a matte surface finish. It's not going to show up very well with a high polish. So I like to go back in after sanding and kind of matte the surface either with a sanding sponge or something like that. So now you can really see the color difference between the two metals. One thing I like to do is just really gently heat this metal with a torch so I can see the difference between the two colors a little bit better. And I'm able to check out any spots that I might have missed, and I can just see the design a little bit better for when I'm going to saw these shapes out. So I'm just doing almost like a heat patina here. I'm just really gently and slowly raising the temperature of the metal until the metal color starts to change, and that's really just to give me some more contrast between the two metal types, the copper and the silver solder. So you can see the metal starting to change. I'm not going for like full black here. I'm looking for this nice heat patinaed copper because it gives me a really nice contrast between that and the silver. Okay, and then once it gets to the point where you're happy with it, you can let it air cool. If you quench it or pickle it, the color's gonna change again. But you can let it air cool. And like I said, the only reason for doing this is just so I can see what I'm doing a little bit better. It's not necessary, so if you don't want to take the time, don't worry about it. It just helps me see the contrast between the two metals a little bit better. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut out each one of these window designs, just leaving a small border of copper around each shape, and they'll become individual earrings. So I'm going to speed up the video a little bit here so you don't have to watch me saw all of them out, and then I'll show you how I turn them into earrings. And you could, if you had a different design that would work a little bit better with a pancake die, you could cut these pieces out with a pancake die. These are close enough together that a pancake die would not work. So I'm using the saw. But we have a huge range of pattern plate designs available, and a lot of them would work well for the solder inlay technique. So you can see I'm just getting my individual designs kind of roughly chopped out here, and then I'll do some refining with a file and sandpaper on the edges. And then after filing each of these, kind of refining them a bit, I'm just sanding them again with the PSA sanding discs to smooth the edges, further refine the shape, remove the file marks, and just get them nice and finished up. And then after I get these fully refined where I'm happy with them, I'm gonna go ahead and put that matte surface back on the metal and do my final heat patina. I like a heat patina for married metals because, like I said earlier, it really shows off the contrast between the two metals. There are a lot of different patina combinations you could do to kind of show off the metals differently based on the metals you're using and what your color preferences are. But I'm just gonna put a matte finish on these, drill a hole to suspend them from an ear wire, and then give them a final heat patina, and then turn them into earrings. So here I've got my pieces ready for their final patina, and then this is my earrings fully finished. I hope you enjoyed this little demonstration on solder inlay, and we would love to see what you make, so please share in the Potter People Facebook group.